conversation today. And I know you're joining from all over the world. So hello, hola, bonjour, marhaba. And I wish I spoke more languages to speak to you in your own too. If you're having trouble understanding the spoken language, you're welcome to turn on the captions at the bottom of your screen. Welcome to our first spotlight session of a series of 7 sessions we'll be holding every weekday at 9 a.m. during the big brainstorm. Today, we'll be spending time together until 10 a.m. ET. I am Ines Yavar, the Next Generation Fellow Lead at the UN Foundation, and I'm accompanied today by a stellar panel of speakers, as well as many changemakers and innovators who were with us yesterday at the big brainstorm big kickoff. There were over 250 of us who joined to explore, prototype, and launch initiatives to tackle some of humanity's greatest challenges. We also launched the 24 innovators who will be leading their teams in brainstorming around solutions to some of humanity's greatest challenges. For those of you who join us for the first time, and as a reminder for those who saw it yesterday, this event is part of a 2-week design sprint. At the UN Foundation, we are committed to supporting young changemakers in shaping the global agenda to tackle the world's most urgent challenges. Our Future Agenda program is designed to deliver impact for the next generation, young people under 30 who make half the world's population today, and future generations, the 10.9 billion people yet to be born this century. These spotlight sessions are one way for us to support us as leading thinkers, entrepreneurs, policymakers, share their insights and engage with us in conversation. So get ready with your questions for the Q&A segment. We will kick off this first spotlight titled The Grand Ambition to Change Trajectories in the Second Half of the SDG Era with a fireside chat including Laurel Patterson, who's the head of the SDG integration at UNDP, Her Excellency Keisha McGuire, President and CEO of the Present and Future Institute, and His Excellency Xolisa Magpongo, Deputy PR of South Africa to the UN. This will be followed by a second fireside chat between Nikolai Hegertun, Senior Advisor at NORAD, and Karina Kwame, Director of Strategy at Purpose. After a quick fire round to all speakers, we will then move to a Q&A. So please do engage in the chat through the session. Everyone was great at doing this yesterday, so I'm looking to an engaging chat today as well. And particularly to you, innovators and changemakers who've joined us today, remember, this session is here to support you as you innovate and co-create in these 2 weeks. So use this space to build on your ideas and expand your horizons. So with a bit of framing done, let's dive into the session today. The theme of the 2023 Big Brainstorm is a year of action for the SDGs in preparation for the upcoming second Sustainable Development Goals Summit that will happen in September. This is an opportunity for the world to accelerate action to solve current and future global challenges. Multiple crises have hit young people like us the hardest. Compared to adults, young people are 2 times more likely to live in poverty and 3 times more likely to lose their jobs. Most young people also live in countries that are underrepresented and marginalized in global bodies. And it's only through international cooperation that we can more effectively protect their interests in the future. Halfway into the 2030 era, it's time to change our approach and start investing in young people. So I would like to turn to our first fireside speakers and ask you all, starting with Laurel Patterson from UNDP, in the light of these multiple crises that I've mentioned and many more that have limited the space to address long-term changes, why is the second SDG Summit so important this year? In other words, why is it so important for young people to take action towards it? Over to you, Laurel. We might need to make perfect.
There, we did it. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for the opportunity to join you in such an exciting conversation and group of people. So when we look at the world today, and you'll see it all from the various perspectives and experiences that you're bringing to the table, one thing that stands out across the board is uncertainty and living in an age of worry. And we experience this in different ways, but nonetheless across the board. And a lot of global research is really showing us that people are more worried than ever before, even in places that may be considered comparatively better off than they ever have been. And so what we're seeing is we're moving into a year, I think we've seen almost an acceleration through COVID, where it's impossible for us to avoid the way that issues and challenges intersect, cascade, collide with each other. We're seeing that more than ever. And we're seeing a sort of an acceleration in the way that we're experiencing those changes. And one of the things that we find particularly from our perspective is this challenge of holding uncertainty on the different ways that we experience it. So one is that immediate uncertainty that we experience in this fragmentation or social polarization, the way that technology is sometimes supporting and sometimes preventing us from really connecting with each other and making progress where we need solidarity. But all of these more rapid changes are taking place on the back of slow moving shifts of climate, of demographics that are changing the world, not with that immediate sort of like moment of day to day or minute to minute, but nonetheless progressing right beneath our feet often. So to me, we have to take the opportunity that we have at the midpoint of the 2030 agenda to ask ourselves, in my perspective, not only how do we ensure that no one is left behind? That's critical. But to me, the question is, in what ways are we moving forward? And I think that's where a group of innovators and young people like yourselves are really important. No, we're not only saying we don't have a mindset of, that people that left behind are victims. These are agents of change, right? As you all are. So in what ways are we moving forward? Can we hold the system in all of its complexity and not only ask ourselves how we move super, super fast, but what are the ways in which our systems are designed, right? In some cases to hold people back. So for me, it's an opportunity, particularly in a group like this, to put tough issues on the table. They don't fall into neat boxes. It's not going to be an SDG 1, 10, and 16, and we move. To the contrary, to me, the beauty of the agenda and its relevance at the midpoint is that it's intersecting. It's full of interlinkages. That's what the 2030 agenda I often describe as our first and only global systems agenda. So that's so important for us to hold on to in a moment like this. What I think is key for the summit, what we need to get out of the summit, is an entirely different level of commitment from our leaders. And for me, there's interesting research, which I only came across a couple of weeks ago, which was looking at the political steering impact of the SDGs. How much do the SDGs influence political decisions? And it probably wouldn't surprise any of you here that that's mixed, but I'll tell you one area that it has not influenced political decisions, and that's around resource allocation. So for me, going into the second half of the agenda, if this can't influence the way that we invest our money, and if we can't do that in a way that asks different questions of what's important to us, so that our resources as communities and countries is aligned with our values, no, we're in for a second half of an agenda that looks a lot like the first half, and we don't have time for that. So for me, it's not a easy, there's no boxes. I can't tell you 5 things, but these are the things that I think, particularly for a group like this, we have to hold the space to explore this kind of complexity. And the insights and the solutions will come from that collective inquiry.
Thank you so much, Laurel, and I definitely agree with you, and I'm sure many of the other panelists do too. I will hand over to Her Excellency Keisha McGuire as the Ambassador and former Permanent Representative of Grenada to the United Nations, but also the current President and CEO of the Future Institute. I'd love to hear your views on why this SDG Summit matters for youth today, but also for future generations.
Thank you very much, Ines. And let me just begin by first thanking the UN Foundation for this kind invitation. I never miss an opportunity to engage with our youth leaders, our agents of change, and all delegations, as I find it invigorating, motivating, and really it serves as a reminder of why we work so hard to push to reshape our world to be fairer and more just. You know, everyone here, and I'm looking forward to hearing more, but they bring smart and innovative ideas to the table. And I know that by working together today, we can indeed set that brighter trajectory for the future. So again, I also welcome the opportunity to engage with my esteemed fellow panelists on this important topic. The SDGs, you know, are very close to my heart. And I began my tenure as Grenada's ambassador to the UN in New York. It was just as we began the implementation phase of the SDGs. And of course, as a small island developing state, that was a time, I would tell you, of great optimism that we were setting a new path, a new trajectory for sustainable development. More recently, as you've mentioned, I started the Present and Future Institute, which is a nonprofit based here in New York that works to build the kind of consensus and drive the implementation that we were hearing there from Laura, implementation action on the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and other important multilateral frameworks, while also working to ensure that future frameworks and actions, whether it be the Summit of the Future, which we know going to happen next year, or reform of the international financial architecture, are thoughtful and considerate of the views of all stakeholders, including the youth. Now, turning specifically to your question, you know, of why the SDG Summit is so important, why it's pivotal. You know, I'm reminded of an adage from my childhood, and it goes, to know where you are going, you must know where you come from. To assess where we are on this path to our destination, we must first look at where we came from. The SDGs are truly groundbreaking. I was groundbreaking at the time, in that they set all-encompassing framework grounded in the notion of leaving no one and no country behind. And as I said at the time, there was great optimism that multilateralism can really push forward the development agenda. However, you know, since we adopted the SDGs, we have witnessed, as we all know, an unprecedented pandemic, trade wars, hot wars, higher developing country debts, and the reshaping of global politics. Against this backdrop, and dare say a bit, abysmal one, it is perhaps unsurprising that we are off track in achieving the SDGs and the 1.5 or 2 degree targets of the Paris Agreement. At the same time, we are seeing multilateralism struggle to be as effective at addressing our current global challenges. The world, we all can admit, has changed. Our institutions must keep a pace. And in this regard, I think that the SDG Summit comes actually at an opportune time to reflect on the challenges we have faced and continue to face with the pandemic, with debt and fiscal constraints, with climate impacts to our food, water, and other systems. The impacts of trade sanctions on prices for fuel and electricity, all of these things were not expected at the time we agreed to the SDGs. So this second summit, in my opinion, provides us a vital chance to reflect on our goals and our progress, given the increasingly difficult multilateral context that we face. We need to chart a trajectory to achievement that is based in the reality of the situations that countries find themselves in. Frankly, this summit and the results from here until 2030 will really be a real reflection on the strength and effectiveness of our multilateral institutions. And I don't just mean the United Nations, but also the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, our intellectual property regimes, and others. It is not overstating things to say we are at a pivotal, a seminal moment in time. Beyond the geopolitics of our time, planetary systems are at risk. We are also aware that the window on limited warming to 1.5 degrees is quickly closing. But it's not just climate change. Many planetary Earth systems are at risk, from our water supplies to our soil, from our forests to our oceans, as we edge ever closer to planetary boundaries and tipping points. The SDGs were also groundbreaking in the terms of human development and calling for investment in education, girls, and our youth. However, as interest rates rise and debt becomes more expensive, governments are forced to make cuts, and we need to work to ensure we protect important investments in human development.
Thank
On
you.
all of these fronts, progress on the SDGs is under threat. So this summit provides the chance to reaffirm our political commitments to the SDGs and to chart a new course to their achievement that considers the realities of the world today. Thank you very much, Ines.
Thank you so much. And I also definitely agree with all that you said. And I've seen that His Excellency Tsolisa Mapongo has also joined us. You've heard the panelists speak, your co-panelist speaks, and coming from South Africa and currently as the Deputy Permanent Representatives of your country to the UN. This summit is particularly important as it sets the ambition for increased action for future generations too. Why is the SDG Summit important to you?
Thank you very much. I think first and foremost, the world is just emerging from the once in a lifetime pandemic, COVID-19. We are currently facing, again, a cost of living crisis that the world has not experienced in many decades. So just these two elements have basically set back the implementation of the SDGs and the 2030 agenda broadly. So this SDG summit coming in September therefore becomes very pivotal in the sense that it's a moment to reset, but it's also a moment to learn from the experiences of these two pandemics, if I were to say, because I think the cost of living crisis that we're facing today is also a pandemic. So how do we, what are the lessons that we're going to learn from this? And how are we going to prepare for future crises? And I think the fact that this summit is also taking place in the context where we are also as the international community, thinking about the summit of the future, thinking about our common agenda as presented by the Secretary General of the UN, I think this is an opportunity for us to really look broadly and at a high level, set our sights on a different way of doing things, a different way of implementation, because when we come out of COVID, we cannot go back to doing things in the same way that we did before. So this is the moment, I think the summit presents us a moment where we can say, what are the things that we are going to do differently? And coming from the African continent, where we have what we call a youth bulge, meaning that the majority of our population is young people. And it will be like that for the next coming decades. So we have to think carefully about how we engage young people, how we bring young people to the conversations, how we take solutions from young people so that we don't determine things for them, but they are part of the solutions. So the SDGs, I mean, it's a broad agenda. As Ambassador McGuire just mentioned, it's quite broad. It is integrated, but how do we prioritize? How does each country prioritize? Is it possible to prioritize? How does a region prioritize? Is it possible for a region to prioritize? So I think these are the questions that we need to engage on as we go to the SDG Summit. And I would highlight maybe just 3 or 4 issues that I think are key, especially from the African perspective. I think the first one is really transforming education. And how do we make sure that we've got an education systems in our countries that respond to the needs of the current of the current moment? So I think this is one area where we need to invest as we prepare for the future for our young generation today. The second area that I would think is very important, again learning from the pandemic, is digital cooperation. And this is also part of the conversation as we prepare for the summit of the future. I think we saw during the time of COVID the benefit of the digital connection. Those who were able to be connected were able to continue with their lives. But more than half of humanity was unable to continue with their lives because they had no a possibility for digital connection. I think from the African continent, when we talk about digital cooperation, we're also talking about basics such as access, just basic access to connectivity. So this is a very key element in my view as we prepare for the summit. Thirdly is jobs. I think Ambassador McGuire has referred to the constraints that governments are facing. You know, the policy space is shrinking. The possibilities for public expenditure are also limited. But we cannot shy away from jobs. We need to create jobs for the young people of today if we are going to bequeath a good future even to the future generations. So that would be for me a third priority. And I think just lastly, then as I conclude, as we go forward at the end of this year, we will again be going to another COP. It will be COP28. And what are we going to do there? I think we will need to build on what was achieved in Egypt in COP27. Firstly, operationalize the loss and damage fund. Make sure that it works by the end of the year all over the world. We see these natural disasters, whether it is floods or fires, but they're happening all over the world, and most of them are linked to climate change. So we need to make sure that the loss and damage fund is operationalized by the time we go to COP28 in the UAE. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, His Excellency Xolisa Mabhongo. We have finished with our first question, and there were so many great insights from our three panelists. I will ask you all to be brief as we answer a second question to give more insights to young people on precisely something that was already mentioned. What urgent investments in the SDGs can not only put us back on track, but have a positive and lasting impact in the lives of young people and future generations? I will go first to Laurel, Keisha, and Xolisa in that order. So Laurel, over to you first.
Answer it two ways, but I'll do it fast both times. So to me, in terms of investments, I think we need to be looking at this with sort of three frames in mind. On the investment side, things like renewable energy are key. These are investments that take a lot of capital, a lot of partnership, and they need to happen at scale now. So that would be the same thing that I would say for pandemic preparedness. So are these big areas of investment that we have to make? At the same time as we think about investment, we also have to think about insurance for people. And so that's investments in social protection. And we saw a lot of innovation through the pandemic to support a different level of social protection for people. What have we learned and how do we take that forward? So one is investments, the second is insurance, and the third is around innovation. How do we take forward innovations that are tech innovations, economic innovations, but also cultural innovations? And here, the second way I wanted to answer this question is I really think in spaces like this, and the other panelists also spoke to this, we need to reclaim our most powerful social technology, and that is dialogue. And to be able to do that effectively, we have to ask different questions of ourselves. And I go back to a quote which has guided a lot of our work over the past couple of years, that what is one of the single greatest indicators of the success of an intervention is the interior condition of the intervener. It's us. It's not somewhere else. It's always today. You may have noticed. So to me, it's really important for us to bring a different perspective in terms of understanding ourselves, understanding our own experiences, our echo chambers, the way that technology can enable, but also prevent us from hearing other people. Then we can create these spaces where we can start to do what Keisha also mentioned, really reflect in a meaningful way on what have we seen, where have we been, where are we headed? But to do that, there's no algorithm for that. There's no big campaign for that. That is us in spaces that are uncomfortable and uncertain, where we're grappling with issues. And to me, this, I think, is a space for young people, particularly to reclaim. It's incredibly human and it's key. If we can't put ourselves back in the driving seat, if we can't reclaim that agency ourselves, it's difficult to see what else would change somewhere else. So that's my provocation for this group.
Thank you, Laurel. And I'm loving the interaction as well of the different speakers and reacting to what each one is saying. To Her Excellency Keisha McGuire, I'll go to you with the same question as well. What urgent investments in the SDGs do we need?
Thank you. I think we need investments, as Laurel has been saying, across the board in our infrastructure of schools, the youth, hospitals, in all spheres of development, because that is the focus for development. But this development must, of course, align with the SDGs and our planetary boundaries. In the climate space, for example, we need to ensure that we invest in adaptation and resilience building with a massive parallel investment in renewables and driving carbon out of our energy and transportation systems. The business case for renewables, and many times folks think there's no business case for it, but there is. The business case for renewables and mitigation is strong and getting stronger every day. Support for adaptation actions, however, is often much more difficult to secure for developing countries, and this needs to be addressed, in my opinion, with urgency. And we must also ensure that we don't simply replace one harm with another. So we need to also look at the full life cycle of electrification, including e-waste management, which is posing a rising challenge, I can tell you, for smaller developing countries. So I think more broadly, we need financial flows for climate action. And the first step, in my opinion, is for countries to commit to fund the Green Climate Fund under the UNFCCC. This is our primary multilateral climate fund, and it is critical that it lead the charge and invest in climate action. That said, and I think this goes to, and I've been monitoring the chat myself, so maybe I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but I think your question also ties in with a question that was posted in the chat by Mohammed Arain, regarding financing and potential alternative means, So this again goes to me, the international financial system, not reflecting the reality of today's world. It was designed after World War II when many developing countries didn't even have independence. There have been several interesting proposals on steps we can take to reform our international financial system. So we're not devoid of the ideas and really credible proposals. For example, the Honorable Prime Minister Mia Mottley and her team in Barbados have put forward the idea for the Bridgetown Initiative, which now is currently garnered a lot of discussion and interest, not just from small islands, but from a range of countries. We also have that ongoing process of the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index to help better inform how the multilateral development banks and creditors assess developing countries. But between these and other discussions happening in this space, including as part of the Summit of the Future process, I am optimistic that all this great thinking and these innovative ideas will crystallize into something concrete that can ensure that all investments are positive and provide the lasting impacts we need. Thanks again, Ines.
Thank you. And I love the concrete examples of different funds. His Excellency Xolisa Mabhongo, I will turn to you with the same question on investments before we turn to our second fireside chat. Over to you.
Thank you. I will be very brief on this. For me, I would really look at political investments. I think the first type of political investment that we need for young people is to rebuild the social contract, the social compact in our countries, and make sure that, and again, I'm talking from the African perspective, where the majority of our population is young people. Make sure that they are part of the conversations, part of the solution. I think that in itself is a huge investment in our future. So we need governance that responds to the needs of young people. But in order for that to happen, young people need to be part of the agenda setting. So that would be, for me, a very important element of the type of investment that we need to build. The second element of political investment would be building trust. I think we need young people to have trust in our societies, to have trust that the world, the society is working in their favor. Again, here, that also requires their own engagement, their agency, their involvement. So I would just say that in addition to what the other panelists have said, these types of political investments are also key going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that was a perfect length as well as we move to our next panel. And I really loved what you just mentioned about young people being part of the agenda setting. And that's precisely what we're also trying to do with the big brainstorm. I can already see some action questions in the chat, and thank you to Her Excellency Keisha McGuire for already addressing one of them. We'll come to some of them later in the Q&A section after our fireside chats. So let me turn now to Nikolai Hegertun from the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation and Karina Kwame from Purpose. Nikolai, turning first to you, as an expert in how the political agenda of the present day is developed and shaped, why do you think the international system is focusing on young people and the future?
Hi, thanks for having me. Do you hear me? All right. I think the short answer is obviously because young people are the ones who are going to deal with all our problems and all our opportunities in the coming years and decades. I think what we know is that, in particular, what the international society are doing right now, that will clearly affect the choices and opportunities of children and young people, right? And even you could add the ones who are not even born yet, right? So I like this quote of a historian called Fernand Braudel. He said that the past always counts because the inequality of the world is the result of structural realities that at once slow to take shape, but very slow to fade away as well. But I think there's another element as well, because one thing is that, of course, we are shaping the choices and opportunities of future generations. But, you know, a fundamental assumption in most economic theories and models, really, for estimating the value of capital and interventions today, this is the use of discount rates. And that's somewhat technical, but the fundamental assumption is that future generations will always be better off than the ones living right now. So that's sort of the model that we've followed, right? And indeed, if you look at like the last 200 years or something, maybe even 300 years, in a lot of countries at least, the lifestyle and the material level and habits of the richest shares of the populations have slowly but surely been mainstreamed into the sort of to the common people. So whether it's the luxury of spices and sugar and, you know, TVs, etc., cars, it has become for many the way of life of the masses as well. And this may have been the rule, right? And it might still be, but increasingly many are questioning this due to the potential irreversible crisis that we are struggling with, whether it's the climate nature crisis, ecosystems collapsing, etc., the oceans. In Norway, we have the biggest sovereign welfare fund in the world. And that is set aside, it's said, for the future generations, right? But if the problem of the future generations are most efficiently dealt with now, we need to shift that rationale, right? We can't save money for the future generation because their problems are needed to be solved right now. And that is why, as one very important reason, I think, as to why young people and the future are being lifted on the agenda. You know, it won't help being rich in a broken world in a way. So in short, I think we're focusing on the future because we know we have a sort of final deadline now for a lot of what we're doing, at least in development cooperation, that we've never had before. Yes, we've had the Millennium Development Goals, and now we have the Sustainable Development Goals, and we set these sort of deadlines, but those are arbitrary deadlines. That, you know, there's something we agree on. But when you're talking about tipping points and points of no returns of climate change, etc., that's really something else.
That was perfect timing, Nikolai. Thank you so much. And Karina, same question to you. With your extensive experience in systems thinking and experience in over 20 countries, I believe, why do you think the international system is focusing on young people and the future?
Wow. Okay. There's so much that's been said already, so I don't want to be repetitive, but I think one of the reasons that I was so excited about this and just hearing Nikolai just speak about this narrative shift that is needed, it's a mindset shift, but I think we're focusing on youth because we know, looking back at history, that youth have played a huge role. Young people, folks earlier on in their life journey, have been the ones driving these mindset and cultural shifts. And I think Honorable Keisha had named this at the top, that in looking back is the only way we can look forward. And I use the word Sankofa, it's a Ghanaian term, and it means to go back and fetch it. So to go back and look at what has been done before. There's definitely a path of no return, a point of no return, that we can't keep doing the same things. But I also am inspired by the role of movements, around the world, independence movements, movements for ending oppressive regimes, regimes that disproportionately impacted folks adversely. And youth have been a huge voice behind those mindset shifts. So I know we've gone on a bit about, the critical mass of youth in certain countries. We know that, more than half are under 30. The lack of access is going to be disproportionately felt by them. But I also see the balance of power in terms of, how is culture and how are systems changing. So I think about, why we focus on youth. I think there's huge narrative power among youth, and Rashad Robinson describes narrative power as the ability to change mindsets, beliefs consistently over time. And we know this, even before all the digital connectivity, that people, in what Laurel was saying, their capacity to dialogue and to listen and hear one another is actually one of the fundamental pieces of how you can build narrative power. And if we're going to be able to, take, as Nikolai said, to really change how we even think about discounting the future and thinking about, how we're saving for the future, but what if that future is already gone? But how do we actually change people's beliefs? Because that's the only way that we'll be able to really have that political investment, to have that change in how resources are allocated. It fundamentally has to start at the level of our core beliefs. And if we think of a house, your foundations are those core beliefs. So if we're trying to change the house and paint it and, make it ready for the future, we're really gonna have to think about those fundamental principles. So I'll talk a little bit on the next question, I think, because there's some elements too to, how we can use creative campaigning, how we can use dialogue and forums like this to actually move that ahead.
Thank you. Already stepping ahead. And I can see so many different questions in the chat that we're getting to after this final fireside. But with this shift in focus, as we were mentioning, there is a lot to be done. So Nikolai and Karina, how is the international system work better for the next and future generations, especially in developing economies? Karina, I'll come to you first in this case. We may have lost Karina, so I will ask Nikolai to go next, and then we'll come back to Karina.
Yeah, you can hear me, right? All right, great. So first of all, I think we need to look at the demographics of the world, right? So there's no question that the young population will be in developing economies, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa, and there's currently, if you look at multi-dimensional poverty, which is, we look a lot of statistics in my work, you've got 1.2 billion multidimensional poor in 111 countries, and half of them are children. So that's a slight hint about, the future poor, or the future, the challenges that we're facing. So we really need to include things like basic stuff like education and health into our assessment of vulnerability. There's some basic stuff, right? Some that we need to address. You can call it like old problems, but in new realities. If you take stunting, just stunting, probably one of the most important variables, right? The impact of stunting on child development are considered to be largely irreversible beyond, I think it's the first 1,000 days of a child's life, for example. So and just the immense costs of, if you look at education, of catching up for lost years of education for many young people in wake of the pandemic is tragic. So but at the same time, as we're moving forward, we need to, things are changing so fast, right? So we can't educate people or young people to jobs and sectors that will go away in a few years, and that's already a problem for many. So you need to be more adaptive. You need to think about speed schools and really speed education in order to re-educate young people. So another thing is that we might have to sort of liberalize development. I think the very fundamental idea just of, say, providing just cash, right, and let people do what they think is best instead of trying to teach and preach development. I think a single sum of cash can achieve much more across a range of different targets. We have research for this, right? And then specific programs. So cash can like empower young people, it can reduce the risk of gender violence, it can spur entrepreneurship, improve self-reliance, all of these things, right? It can allow you to work smarter, not getting exploited, not, you know, grasping the first and worst job, right? So I think that will be important, and I think many people are waking up to that realization. And migration is one last thing I want to say about this, because people often talk about brain drain when it comes to migration. But if you don't let young people with skills and talents move around, they can end up being brain stranded, as you know. And Europe, US, China, all are going to be populated by very old people very soon. My country as well. So we need to rethink migration as a win-win, really. And some of the things we need to do, at least.
Thank you, Nikolai. And I think we've got Karina back. So in case you weren't able to hear my question, Karina, how can the international system work better for the next and future generations, especially in developing countries?
Thank you. And I had one of those moments where I was completely held by the digital world and had to go back. So appreciate the question again. I would say, gosh, I think there's a lot of tools we have. I think it's how we set ourselves up to use them, not just in the smartest way, but in the most intentional way. And I say intentional because at the core of the work we do at Purpose is really about how are we centering impacted voices. But you can't do that if the environment and the access to those resources isn't designed to do that. So really thinking about, you know, when we're telling stories, I saw there was a question too about how do we even begin to shift mindsets? You need to have those voices that are impacted, but they need to be, you know, appropriately and intentionally set up to thrive. And we say that, we describe it as narrative, giving and supporting narrative infrastructure. And we've been talking about, you know, systems infrastructure. I come from engineering, so I always think about transport, I think about water, about electricity, and I want you to think about those same things, but for how we change beliefs. So you're going to need building blocks to do that. You're going to need voices that people trust. And then those voices need to be really set up with channels and access points that people are actually hearing what needs to be shared. And also understanding, you know, how the audience is receiving this information. And again, mentioned I was an engineer. I also come from music. And so you also need to be putting yourself in the seat of the audience that's listening to what you're saying. And those components, the voices people trust, the channels, and really understanding where your audience is at, are fundamental pieces of having a narrative infrastructure, so that when you have events like this, when you have the SDG summit, when you have things happening in your country or city, there are channels ready to tell that story. So I think one of the things about how can the international system, you know, set this up? You know, forums like this, I think, are really a reminder of these. I think, to Laurel's point before, like really getting to the core of what dialogue is. And dialogue, you know, for a musician is really, you know, one speaks and another is listening. And I say active listening, fundamentally a part of that. But you need to have that environment and the infrastructure around you so that that can work. Otherwise, you really get into this issue of, you know, not just inequality, but inequitable access. And so then we're actually trying to to fix things, but then our solutions will miss the mark. I guess one last thing I just want to leave with is that how we are co-creating these spaces together becomes really fundamental to not just dialogue, but to how that narrative infrastructure can be ready. So when I say intentional, it's really, you know, stripping back to some of those things that we do have in common. And we've talked a lot about youth, but youth is not a static term. Like, these young people are going to grow up. And so even with some of the work we're doing at Purpose around early childhood education is knowing that, you know, children under 5 will not be under 5 forever. So much that is laid at that early fundamental stage really does have an influence on your future trajectory into your teens, you know, adulthood and thereafter. So again, in creating spaces like this, there's also a co-creation aspect that has to have an intergenerational lens to it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Karina. And that's precisely why we're having this conversation, an intergenerational conversation. And I'll come to all of our experts and speakers now for a final question as we wrap up our fireside. So this is a fire round, 1 minute each. And to those of you online who maybe didn't hear the instruction at the beginning, please do share your questions in the chat. We're coming to them in just a minute. So with less than 7 months to go to the SDG Summit, and 7 years to end of the 2030 agenda, what is your main tip to young people looking to shape the global agenda? So I will come to Laurel first, and we'll continue in our order as before. Laurel, over to you.
Things that you can do is reach out to people that you think are influencers in your space on the issues that are most important to you. Pick up the phone, send a message. You'll be surprised how many people want to come together and talk about some of these critical issues. Lead it yourself. I mean, a lot of the work, I put some ideas in the chat. We've done similar things. You'd be surprised. So I'd say recognize that it's you. Really map your networks. Call people from wherever you think they can. Call me. I think you should call any of the panelists here as well too. But really start to hone in your own agency to convene, put the hard issues on the table, and then see what happens from there.
Perfect and to the point. Thank you so much, Laurel. Her Excellency Keisha McGuire, over to you. What is your main tip to young people?
Yes, for me, I mean, the main tip, and I think is just simply keep working together, because your voice is powerful. So the unity that you have to be able to, and you know, Laurel talked about getting in a space and amplifying. You have to have that outreach, but you're stronger together, because a lot of these processes are happening, of course, at the intergovernmental level, but there is a process and there is a way in which you can get in there, get your voice heard, get your perspective on the table, because again, this is for you. It is for your future. So I think if you're working together, you can make that voice as impactful and as powerful as you can. And events like today are key, because these are the sorts of platforms that provide that wonderful opportunity to hear directly from you youth leaders and for your voices to help share the outcomes. So I think we need to just continually work to create space for the youth to engage with political leaders and decision makers. We must make sure that your voices as the leaders of tomorrow are at the table to shape your own futures.
That was perfect. Thank you so much, Keisha. To His Excellency Solisema Pongo, it's the same question as well. What is your one tip?
Mine is very simple to young people. Don't complain, organize. Thank you.
Straight into the point. Don't complain and organize. And I think it goes to Keisha's point earlier as well about working in collaboration. Nikolai, same question as well.
Yeah, I think it's very important that you try to define the problem, the most important problem that you see, and try to get some, you know, other people into that problem definition. So to define the problem, that will just automatically get it on the agenda, I think. And you need to prioritize. I think, you know, just try to think about some questions. What is the most important thing? And then that's the problem. And also, just what is neglected? Where can you make a difference by focusing on something that other people are neglecting? And what is solvable as well? And what kind of you can get a problem anyway, right? But if you have a solution that you can advocate for at the same time, you can convince people about a problem, and then you can say, this is the solution. That will really, if you look at all kinds of literature on research on who have been able to set the agenda politically, that is a key thing to do. And what is possible to postpone, and what is burning right now? I think that's some questions that I really recommend that you think about.
Thank you, Nikolai. And to close off this fire round session, Karina, same question. What is your recommendation and tip?
Yeah, I would say connect the story that you want to tell with the bigger narrative goal that you want to see in the world. And I think that, for instance, my story is one of I'm the daughter of immigrants. I grew up in a house, with the music at the table, as well as the sciences. And for me, that was quite, a siloed experience. But I think, if we're going to have solutions, and you all are working on solutions that are going to combine lots of different disciplines, that's really speaking to that complexity and uncertainty and how you bring those together in a thoughtful way. So my goal is to see that, being the broader direction of travel and seeing where my story fits into it. And I think that really opens up a lot of opportunities, working across the SDGs, not seeing an issue space as too far. Actually, there are opportunities for those points of overlap. And really going back to that narrative power, that's how you do it. You are able to create a system where people see their stories in these broader, very complex and messy movements. So yeah, and I think that also gives individuals, a bit of agency in their role and what does feel overwhelming. So yeah, connect your story to the bigger one. Yeah.
Thank you. We will certainly do that. I think Nikolai may have lost connection. I know he was trying to charge something, but hopefully we get him back. For now, our Q&A. So keep those questions coming in the chat. I think I'm going to go to one of the ones that came last because it was seconded by someone else. So two people wanted to ask this. Sana Ayaz, who says that she's a clinical psychologist in Pakistan, and there is a rising awareness in her country, but still a lack of resources for young people. So her question is, how can we be elemental at the grassroots level to instill a change so that the SDGs are in mobility as a norm and priority rather than as a later integration? And these questions, if they're not directed to any specific panelist, I will just ask them, and whoever would like to speak, just raise either your physical hand or your virtual hand, and we'll give you the floor. Who would like to take this one? Yes, I can see Keisha. Go ahead, Keisha.
Great question. And, I've heard it in a climate context that, climate challenges are global, but climate solutions are local. And that, I think, is the key to this. It's about the grassroots. It's about bringing, and you have to bring in, of course, also the ambassador from South Africa mentioned about education. You have to bring the education to the youth, because you literally have to educate the minds and in the home. And charity, as we all know, begins at home. So I think is having a structured education campaign at the grassroots levels in ways in which it will be effective given the social circumstances, the culture. I think that is how you can be as most effective, particularly as policymakers, as they try to implement these more global policy initiatives.
Thank you. Laurel, wanting to answer the same question, over to you.
To put ideas and things in the chat as well as we go, but I think what's really important, to Keisha's point as well too, is that you provide voice and opportunity for people to speak directly. So we've done a lot of work recently on Indigenous futures. And if you haven't come across this space, it is powerful. And of course, connecting both past and present. But one of these key challenges that they talk about is this notion of extraction and erasure. So I think what's really important as you're thinking about that grassroots, provide the space for voice, and don't try to summarize it, don't try to encapsulate it, let it speak and stand for itself. And that goes, of course, for all of you as well too. I think you're not looking for a seat at the table. I think you're not looking for opportunities to be created for you. You create them. That's a lot of what we're talking about here. It's your voice and articulation. You're not trying to fit into somebody else's narrative, also to Karina's point. So just some other thoughts to think about from a grassroots perspective too.
Thank you. And I think that does answer another question that came through from Tesfahun, who was asking about how young people can engage beyond virtual participation. And you've both highlighted that really grassroots is very important. I will go to another question now. And again, any speaker who would like to take it, please feel free to raise your virtual or physical hand. But I will go to a question that Mohammed raised on how smaller countries can hold larger countries accountable for action on the SDGs. And he was mentioning that while the rules based on international system does provide a platform, there is an imbalance of influence that's skewed towards certain countries, and this was mentioned earlier. So how can we ensure the accountability required for an inclusive future conducive for prosperity for all? Any takers? And I know these are complicated last minute questions, but Keisha's ready for it.
Another great question, and it's more a practical one. Look, yes, of course, we know in terms of influence, it could be skewed, but we must not discount that the smaller countries, the smaller economies have their own power that they can leverage. The numbers, there's power in numbers, resolutions that need to get passed. It's so if you actually embrace your numbers, organize, as we've heard, honestly, you have your own leverage that can counteract some of that influence. And in making that sort of demands, when you come together, it cannot easily be ignored, even in that scale, considering the different influential dynamics.
And very true, coming from an expert. Thank you, Ambassador McGuire. Over to you, His Excellency Talita.
Thank you. I think in addition, I think we need to bring, to young people in the more developed countries need to also hold their governments accountable in terms of their international obligations, whether it is on climate or any other global challenge that the world is facing. So we need those linkages between young people in the South and young people in the North, because when we talk about the 2030 agenda and the SDGs, this is an integrated agenda. It applies to all countries, unlike the MDGs, which were mainly for developing countries. So we now have an integrated agenda. And I think what is most important for us to move forward is political will. And I think we can generate political will both in the South and in the North by young people coming together, organizing together, and holding leaders accountable in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. And I see Karina also has an answer to this question.
Yeah, I just want to double click on His Excellency's note about youth solidarity across borders, because I think as like the great movements of the past as well, even without all the digital connectivity that we have, though people were supporting one another's movements across national boundaries. And I think acknowledging that is a really powerful mechanism. I would even say for political change globally, pressure that is put for that accountability by folks, within those borders and outside is absolutely critical. I would also say that acknowledging where countries have made really, really pivotal commitments and celebrating that. So I think, for instance, like Ecuador is the only country that has set, rights of nature in their constitution. And obviously politically, that's not necessarily dependent on a particular party, but that understandably has a story of lots of grassroots mobilization at all levels. And so being able to acknowledge those wins and then, looking ahead, what needs to be repaired to do that sort of work. So yeah, I would equally say that it's not to just say if the countries are small, that it's not, the balance of power can't shift, but to say that there's mighty power that can be had.
Thank you so much. And your insights are really invaluable. And as Laurel mentioned earlier, please feel free to respond to questions in the chat as well. I'm doing my best to get to them all. There was a question that came through from Sarah about investing in youth. And I know this was a question earlier, but maybe it's a challenge. And how will you, or what organizations do you know that provide youth with the necessary tools to achieve the investment in youth? Any thoughts? And I can see Isaac wrote a similar question in the chat on necessary tools and resources to tackle these pressing challenges. What kind of plans are there? Any takers? I know some of you mentioned this as well in your own speeches earlier. It might be just worth reminding. Kaigama is mentioning the global youth mobilization in the chat. Any others that you know? Yes, Laurel, thank you.
I can come in on a few. So I had put in the chat as well the SDG action campaign. I think there's great resources and opportunities there, gatherings as well, and good networking opportunities. There's a lot of youth interaction around the UN's peace and security agenda. So you can look that up, and I think that's a really powerful space for change. And it's also, you have a lot of trailblazers already who have activated that space of youth advocacy and engagement around peace and security agenda. Some of the things I'd put in the chat earlier are more tools that are available for anybody, but I think particularly for a group like this, we work a lot at the intersections of methods in my team and at UNDP. So how do you bring different forms of data, understand the evidence differently? How do you connect it with futures or with the foresight? So not only where have we been, but what's possible? And then how do you create dialogue spaces or spaces of influence where you can move that together? So I have a couple of points in the chat that you could take a look at, but I would also encourage you, lean into data in a way that may not always seem as obvious. How can that help you to build perhaps an uncommon perspective or reflection that you can move an issue forward with? A lot of influence and so on, of course, is understanding who you're trying to influence and why. And you need different tools in your toolkit to be able to do that. So part of what we're trying to provide is a range of ways of thinking about it. You'll see in the chat I put on vaccine equity, we're trying to combine all different kinds of data, not to make an epidemiological case for vaccine equity, others are making it, but a socioeconomic case. So we run thought experiments right there in that space you can pull up for your own countries. What if the poorest countries in the world had the same vaccination rate as the richest country in October 2021? What would that mean in terms of GDP? And it flips the question from countries receiving money to countries that are prevented from realizing their potential because of a lack of fairness in an international system. We saw that around vaccines. So again, I hope some of that is useful for you. And what we're trying to do is just build those methods and insights in different ways. You pull what's most valuable to you. I know that's only a small drop in a much bigger pond, but a couple of ideas.
Very useful, and I've seen some come through in the chat as well. His Excellency Salisa, I saw you raise your hand as well.
Yeah, I think maybe just to mention, I think this is something that we all know in the context of the preparations for the Summit of the Future. There is a wide space that has been open for multi-stakeholder engagements across all the tracks of the Summit of the Future. And I think this is a very important space for young people through their organizations, their associations, to basically get involved and influence the agenda. So this space is wide open between now and September 2024 for young people to be part of the multi-stakeholder engagements for the Summit of the Future. The second element is obviously the fact that one of the very early deliverables from our common agenda is the creation of the UN Youth Office. And I think this will be another very important platform for young people to engage. I mean, if you look at the resolution that created this youth office, it really sets a broad agenda for what this youth office should do in terms of bringing the concerns of young people to the center of UN normative and policy making spaces. So this is a second opportunity that I think is just out there for young people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we're coming to the end of our second round. I think Karina maybe wanted to raise her hand. So we'll come to you and then I'll ask a final question.
I'm defaulting to you on the timing, so just give me a shout. I guess just to, I think, answer that last question, I saw another one in the chat too, just about how we sway audiences, and particularly adults was one of the groups. I've put a few links in the chat. So there's one link to narrative changing, and it's a whole curriculum, open source resources that really help you go through those different steps of thinking about not just your narrative goal, but like who are the audiences you're trying to reach, and just gives you some questions that you can ask and be thinking about. So not just specific to that question, but if you're trying to say reach, parents or even grandparents, or if you're trying to reach, a subgroup within that category, there's just different ways you can think about where that audience is, where they need to get to, and what are some of the ways, that you can engage them. There's also some resources I'll add it to the chat as well. Just how do you tell a systemic story? Like one of the things we know from our work in climate is obviously, doomism. It can be really scary. It can be really demoralizing, and people, that kind of story doesn't get folks at the table ready to engage on the issue. So what are some of the ways that you can tell a systemic story in a way that's not just compelling, but also, engaging, but persuading folks. So I'll add that as well. And then we have a group at Purpose who run our racial equity impact practice, powerhouse team, and they have lots of really different case studies and approaches, offerings to how you can actually think about this with a racial equity lens. And so obviously this is a global perspective, but how are you actually addressing that piece in terms of incorporating equity? So I'll put those in the chat. They're not necessarily investment resources, but I think investing in your story is a huge step in doing any of this work.
Thank you so much, Karina. And that was actually a question I was going to go to, so it's perfect. There have been so many more coming through, and we have written them down. So where we have elements to bring, we will be responding to them via email as well. I have really loved being a part of this conversation. And as Nikolai wasn't able to join us in this Q&A, I do want to just highlight a quote that he said earlier, that we won't be rich in a broken world. And I think we can really all resonate with that. And we have lots of moments throughout the year and in the years to come to continue moving forward as opposed to backward. The SDG Summit, of course, is one of them. The Summit of the Future next year is linked, and this was mentioned earlier as well. There have been books recommended in the chat. I'm certainly going to go and take a look at some of the ones that were mentioned. Do follow us on social media and connect with the different innovators. The post with most likes on our Instagram page will be awarded the Mobilizer Award at the Big Pitch on the 28th. So let's continue to rally young people around the different solutions that have been proposed to achieve the SDGs. Do join us at the Big Pitch on the 28th of February. Please scan the code or visit our futureagenda.org/bigbrainstorm to get your tickets. And of course, join any of the Future Spotlight sessions happening every weekday at 9 a.m. till the Big Pitch via the link that you're also seeing in on your screens right now. I just wanted to end with thanking our excellent speakers. I couldn't have thought of a better panel. Thank you so much, Laurel Patterson from UNDP, Her Excellency Keisha McGuire from the Present and Future Institute, His Excellency Talisa Mapongo, Deputy Permanent Representative of South Africa to the UN, of course, Nikolai Hegertun from NORAD, and Karina Kwame from Purpose. Thank you all for joining us today, and to all the young people who joined us. It's been great to see. I think we almost reached 100 young people on the call at one point, and it's really amazing to see all the solutions that are being proposed, the innovations that are being worked on. Young people are having this session and then going off to discuss how to better achieve the SDGs together. So we count on you all to continue doing that on the lead up to the SDG Summit and beyond. And of course, if there are any questions, my email has been put in the chat. Please feel free to reach out. We will continue this conversation throughout the week. Our next spotlight session is on Monday, and it will be on the topic of education. So please join us there, and let's continue to engage. We're right on time. Thank you so much. I see all the comments in the chat. It's been amazing to have this conversation with you all. Have a great rest of your day. We don't want to close the call because we see all the comments coming in, but thank you, everyone. We will see you very soon again.